Thank you for joining us on this Monday afternoon. Welcome to the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center's January Science Seminar. Today, we are going to be featuring talks from three Midwest Cask project leads. Just a couple housekeeping notes before we get started. We will be recording this webinar. It's going to be shared out to all registrants and posted on our YouTube channel later this week. So please, we ask that you mute yourself and choose your video status now. If you don't want to be on camera, you do not have to be. We are going to have three short presentations today. We're going to have some Q&A time after each of them. So please feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A function throughout the seminar today. We will address them as many as we can. We'll also invite our speakers to respond in the Q&A itself. Yeah, if you have any questions or technical issues throughout the seminar today, feel free to send a message in the chat to me. With that, I'm going to hand things over to Alyssa Welch.
Thanks, Jess. Before we get started with our speakers here, I'd just like to provide a very brief background on the Midwest Cask as a reminder and a reinforcement of our regional research collaborations. So the Midwest Cask, for those of you that don't know yet, is a partnership between the USGS and a consortium of 8 partner institutions that you can see here on the screen across the region. And at University of Minnesota, where I am located, where our host institution is the host center for that consortium. We're part of a national network of regional casks, all of whom work to produce science that informs research management efforts and is meant to help fish, wildlife, water, land, and people adapt to a changing climate. The work that we support in the Midwest centers around a specific set of activities, including conducting synthesis research on relevant regional priorities. And you can find those science priorities in the science agenda on our website. We also support a network of graduate students and postdoc fellows. We partner with our consortium member College of Menominee Nation on an undergraduate research program, and we'll be announcing that program here in the coming months, so watch for that RU program. And we host capacity building workshops and an annual gathering. I think Jess is going to mention that in a minute. And we also work with USGS as the funder for climate adaptation research projects and partnerships. I am going to turn it back over to Jess here for a couple of those important announcements.
Yeah, so as Alyssa mentioned, we have announced the date and location for our 2024 annual gathering. That's going to be August 13th to 15th, and it's going to be hosted by Michigan State University in East Lansing, Michigan. More to come soon, but for now, save that date. We hope we can see you all there. And then we have a training coming up for our early career researchers. Those are graduate students and postdoctoral researchers who are associated with the Midwest Cask. On February 14th, we'll be hosting a training on climate adaptation planning featuring some experts from the field. So if you are an early career researcher in our network or you advise one, keep your eye out on your inbox and calendar invites for more information on that. And with that, I think I'm turning things over to Desi to introduce today's speakers.
Great, thank you. So I'm really excited to welcome our 3 speakers today, Dan Isermann, Owen McKenna, and Daniel Griffin. And each speaker will speak for about 10 minutes. I will probably try to cut you off if it goes too much further, because we want to make sure that we have a couple minutes after each speaker for questions. If you have a question for one of our speakers today, please go ahead and add them to the chat. And then once we come to the Q&A time, we can pull those up. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who is Dan Isermann. Dan is with us today from the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, where he is the unit leader of the USGS Wisconsin Cooperative Fisheries Research Unit. Dan's research focuses on the population dynamics and management of exploited fish populations, with special emphasis on the estimation of fish age and growth and the evaluation of harvest regulations and stocking. Dan, thanks for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you now.
All right, thanks for the introduction. I'm going to talk to you today about our project focus on walleye stocking success in the Midwestern USA. And this was primarily completed by Bobby Davis, who's shown here with the walleye. He was our postdoc, and he's now a professor at Northland College. And we worked with all of the agencies pictured here on the title slide. So walleye exist across the landscape along a spectrum of recruitment sources, and that includes some populations that are supported by natural reproduction. We have some in the middle that are sort of a combination of natural reproduction and stocking. And then for most of the Midwest, we are reliant on stocking to support those populations. And walleye support very popular fisheries within this region and are species of management focus for most of the agencies in the region. The conundrum we're facing is that natural recruitment is declining in some places, so we're not getting those fish from natural sources anymore, and in some cases, we're actually seeing declines in stocking success over time. And in both cases, these can be linked to climate-related changes in habitat conditions and fish communities. And so what that means is regardless of where we are on the spectrum, we're likely to see a higher demand for walleyes that have been artificially propagated and can be stocked in these lakes. And that's somewhat of a finite resource or a limited resource. So we're going to have to probably get better at allocating those fish in the future. And that was the goal of our project, is to help managers better allocate these fish. So first, we wanted to identify what factors influence fingerling stocking success. And the picture here, the upper picture, is about what a walleye fingerling would look like. And then really develop a tool or a model framework that agencies could use to better allocate these fish now and into the future. And we suspected that a variety of different kinds of variables were going to influence stocking success. And we went on an information gathering exercise to pull all of this information together. And this is how we worked with our collaborators. We started this as a discussion forum with the Walleye Technical Committee, and they're part of the North Central Division of AFS, and each state has a representative. So we engaged them in this meeting. We talked about what should we use as predictor variables, what kind of issues should we expect with the data and data access, and they also provided us the data eventually. We did reach out to our tribal contacts, the folks that we work with regularly related to walleye questions, but in a lot of cases, they're not necessarily involved with stocking, or the stocking evaluations are actually handled by the state agency. So that was sort of where we ended up on that part of it. And what we ended up with for fingerling walleye stockings was more than 2,000 events from 1990 to 2019 that we would use in our analyses. Again, thanks to those agency partners that I showed on the title slide. These are the states that provided us info. You can see they're spread out throughout the region. One thing we had to deal with is the data are not consistent across individual states. So we came up with this sort of percentile rank approach. So we could rank, say, a walleye catch rate within a state as good or bad based on the whole distribution for that state. And then we use random forest models to try to determine what variables were important. So just some really broad things that we addressed at first. Does walleye stocking simply work better as we move further north? And the answer to that appears to be no, that latitude across the region was not that important. And this is kind of good news because it means walleye stocking can be successful throughout the region, and we're just not talking about a certain part of the region. And then we asked, is walleye stocking overall declining through time? And we also saw little evidence of that, at least at the broad scale. There were trends in some individual states that might suggest this could be occurring. The one thing that we found is that the individual lake is really important, and that explained a pretty good chunk of the variability. And when we look at the variables that we gather together, so this is just a list of the top 5 or 6. So There was more than a dozen of these, but largemouth bass abundance comes through as a really important variable, explaining walleye stocking success, as does growing degree days, how many fish we stock, lake surface area, a variety of these metrics. But this is sort of what we did with that data to develop that model to try to determine what might matter when these managers are stocking fish. And this is just a look at the relationships. They're noisy. You can see some bounce in them. That first one, panel A, though, is largemouth bass versus walleye abundance or walleye stocking success. And you can see a general decline. And as you get to higher bass abundance, it becomes more difficult to achieve success. One thing that was interesting is we use these sort of bivariate dependence plots, and yellow would be good and sort of deep purple would be bad here for walleye stocking success. And larger lakes, largemouth bass are less of a concern in smaller lakes. So in small lakes, if we see bass continue to expand, we may see lower stocking success for walleye. And when we look at growing degree days or warming, again, being large in terms of a lake kind of mitigates that effect. So in smaller lakes, additional warming in the future could also mean lower walleye stocking success. And our model is noisy overall, but generally we're pretty good at predicting when walleye stocking success might be over the median. If our model was performing really poorly, we'd have a lot more observations in these red squares on the map. So it may not be good at exactly telling us what we might get, but it's pretty good, or seems pretty good, at telling us when we might be better than average, so to speak. And so then this is the tool that we developed for managers to be able to use. It's currently in review, USGS FSP protocols, but this would allow a manager to input the information on their system and look at the probability of walleye stocking success for that system. And then you can start to sort of manipulate those predictors and maybe increase bass abundance or increase growing degree days to see what might that success look like 10 years down the road. And we're trying to work with this to maybe generate some maps with at least those two variables, but this will be available to the public to use when we get it fully reviewed. And that's all I had for you today.
Great, thanks so much, Dan. I encourage everyone to drop some of your questions for Dan into the meeting chat, and we will get to those. I see there's one question already from Olivia. Dan, other size options other than fingerlings for stocking with consideration for both costs and GDD, I'm guessing that's growth degree days. Are there other size options? Is that what you're asking, Olivia?
Yeah, so there are, the other common approach is fry stocking, and we did analyze those data, but that was almost exclusively in Minnesota, and so I just didn't show it today. A lot of the factors were similar in terms of what influenced success, but not all of them. But we, for the purposes of today, I just left it out. This work is in review right now at North American Journal of Fish Management, the paper that goes with it, and the fry information is included there.
And the fry would be cheaper. Is that right, Dan?
Yeah, there'd be less propagation costs. However, typically in a lot of systems, much lower survival because you're stocking them at such a small size. It's not always true, but typically, so there's like a cost benefit relationship to raising those fish until they're that fingerling size in terms of hatchery space, and also sometimes in terms of feeding the fish if they're in a pond or raceway scenario.
Thanks, Dan.
Not a problem.
Okay, got another question here from Leland. Are there studies on stream populations of walleye and variables related to natural and stocked populations?
And was that stream populations?
Stream populations of walleye and variables related to natural and stocked populations.
Yeah, so some of the data that are included in our study would have been from what I'd call riverine systems. So we would call them flowages at this latitude, but reservoirs or impoundments. That would include riverine stretches, but specifically like smaller streams that might be stocked, they were probably excluded from our analysis. One of the issues we ran into with some of that is like the evaluation part of it is kind of weak. They might stock the fish, but they don't necessarily evaluate them. And it's a little less common for walleye to be stocked in those kind of systems. It does occur, but they probably would have been, if we would have had the data, they probably would have been eliminated from our sort of lake-based approach.
Thank you. And here's another question. Did you look at the average size of stocked fingerlings across states? And then does this include fall, extended growth versus spring?
So we ended up pooling them. Sometimes it's because we didn't actually have the information on the length of that specific stocking. You know, they just stocked the fish and they might have had probably general information as to how large the fish were for a group of fish that were leaving the hatchery, but it wasn't necessarily included with that specific stocking event. So that was a common problem. I do think we ran the models separately though at one point for small fingerlings versus large or the extended growth. The problem is the small fingerlings are not stocked that frequently, and I think we had trouble getting the model to fit when we just only use that smaller size. I'd have to check with Bobby though to see if we had any results for the split between the two fingerling sizes. You're muted, Desi. Yeah.
Thank you. So I think looks like that's all we have right now in the Q&A. If you think of another question for Dan, please go ahead and put it in to the chat and we can try to get to it at the end. But thank you so much, Dan. And if you can stick around for the final Q&A, I'll appreciate that. And we'll go ahead and move on to our next speaker, who is Owen McKenna. And Owen is a research ecologist at the USGS Northern Prairie Wildlife Research Center. And he's also a visiting scientist with the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. Owen's research is focused on studying how changes in climate and land use can alter the hydrology and geochemistry of prairie pothole wetlands, and estimating the future impacts on critical migratory waterfowl habitat. Thanks for joining us, Owen, and I will pass the controls over to you now.
Great, thanks, Desi. Can we see my screen?
Yep, you're good.
Looks great.
All right, perfect. Well, thanks. And today I wanted to talk about a project that has a lot of pieces, and with that has a very long title. So I kind of broke it down into 3 different components here of kind of what and how and where. So as Desi mentioned, the research I lead focuses a lot on prairie pothole wetlands or depressional wetlands that are not thought of as very connected to our stream networks, but really this project is focused on understanding how climate change is going to be impacting whether or not these wetlands will be connected to the stream networks and what the implications are for not only migratory waterfowl, but also water quality in our tributaries and streams and large rivers. So what are we doing? We're co-developing geospatial modeling tools to support conservation investments. How are we doing that? Like I mentioned, we're focusing on really this climate-driven wetland to stream connectivity, how often it happens under different climate conditions, and where we're in the upper Mississippi River Basin, more specifically the Minnesota River Basin. So thanks to my co-authors on this. This is a big collaborative project that has lots of really interesting pieces. And so, yeah, so to bring you to the landscape that I study, this is sort of the variety that we see across the upper Mississippi River Basin, the upper Midwest, the Prairie pothole region, areas where we have grasslands and croplands and wetlands and drained wetlands, and this variability of connectivity throughout the landscape in terms of surface water hydrology. And so this project, we're really focusing on looking at these wetlands, this landscape at different spatial scales, both the individual wetland basin unit, as well as the wetland complex scale, and then understanding how these small water bodies, on average, about a hectare or smaller, how they kind of aggregate across the landscape to provide these different services, and how those services will be impacted by changes in climate. And so to kind of frame everybody about the approach that we're using here, so because we're looking at things on different spatial scales and temporal scales, we're sort of asking a lot of different modeling tools and frameworks. And so most of the models that I work with are rooted in empirical long-term wetland hydrology modeling. And we've developed process-based models to simulate water levels and frequency of spill of these wetlands through time. And then we are working more and more with geospatial modeling tools to say something about how these processes that happen at such small scales aggregate across the landscape. And then ultimately for this project and other projects, we're working with our tribal partners and federal and state management agencies, as well as NGOs. And so bringing us to the Minnesota River Basin, this is an area that is a nice crossover where it's in the Prairie pothole region, and it's also part of the upper Mississippi River Basin. So you have not only management for production of migratory waterfowl habitat in these depressional wetland systems, but you're also dealing with a lot of the issues that go along with large river systems as well. And so about a year and a half ago, we kicked off this project with a workshop with our partners to understand what types of management issues they're dealing with. And you can see in this zoomed in area, these different colors are different agencies and stakeholders and rights holders that are managing wetlands and dealing with water quality issues and all sorts of other issues on their waters and lands. And so we wanted to bring them together to try to understand within this sort of patchwork landscape, what types of decisions they're making in regards to managing the areas that they currently own, as well as prioritizing future acquisitions. And to kind of get at this further, we wanted to quantify not only where folks are working currently, but also put those investments in the context of these small watersheds across the Minnesota River Basin to show where are the non-riverine wetlands. And so across this 43,000 square kilometer watershed, we've got an estimated 135,000 wetlands broken up across about 505 HUC 12 sub-basins here. And so you can see that a lot of the majority of the intact wetlands, the highest densities are up here in the northwest, and also as we get closer to the confluence of the Mississippi River, with a lot higher restoration potential here in the middle of the basin. And then of that, we also wanted to understand, like I said in the beginning, some of these wetlands are considered to be more isolated or not as connected to the riverine networks. So we're quantifying, of those wetlands using very high resolution elevation models, how connected are these wetlands to the stream networks, and understanding, which under different climate conditions, which ones could be more or less connected to the riverine network. And this really comes into play a lot with water quality issues, where residence time of water in these wetlands really controls the conservation potential and the nutrient reduction potential of these wetland systems. And to give you a sense of what higher and lower wetland stream connectivity watersheds look like, on the left here is a watershed that has a lot less connected wetlands and a lot smaller basins that are upland embedded and further away from the stream network itself. And then the one on the right here, you can see a lot larger basins that are much more closely connected to those stream networks. And so what we're doing is using a hydrology model to simulate when water from these little basins spill and how many spill steps they are away from the stream network itself. And then with that, we're also simulating surface water in the wetlands, because if there's no water in the wetlands, they don't provide much of a service in terms of migratory waterfowl habitat. And then Becky Kreiling is helping to develop, once this water leaves the wetlands, what's the potential in terms of nutrient retention of the wetlands itself. And so you can see under a lower precipitation regime, you can have just minimal connection between the wetlands themselves. Whereas if you add more water onto the landscape, you can see that these are much more connected. So we're simulating climate change and developing kind of the historical regimes, and then simulating future climate scenarios of, under different scenarios, how connected are these wetlands, and what does that mean in terms of not only migratory waterfowl habitat, but then also water quality. And then Audrey Lospike's really leading the effort on trying to help us to create this in an interactive dashboard decision support tool, so that we can go back to those managers that we had that workshop with to try to help them make this as usable as possible. And with that, I'll take any questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Owen. I will give it just a minute here to see if there's any questions in the chat for Owen. Please go ahead and put them in there. While we're waiting for some questions to submit, I'll just add that painting of the vanishing wetlands is absolutely, yes, that it's beautiful. It's really captures so much. And it kind of got me thinking about the impact of the losses of these wetlands and the connectivity and the implications, not only to wildlife, but also to local communities and cultures and rights holders. I'll just get my quick question in there. I'm wondering if there are any specific cultural considerations that you and your team had thought about as you approach this topic and the workshops.
Yeah, so what was interesting about the Minnesota River Basin is that, as I mentioned, some of the partners that we're working with on this are the 4 Dakota tribes that are situated either on the Minnesota River itself. I think this is Upper Sioux right here, or the Prairie Island is just past the confluence on the main stem of the Mississippi River. And so in reaching out to those partners at those tribes, I was really interested in their take on how they approach managing wetlands and the cultural importance of these wetlands, and especially in developing programs to propagate wild rice. And it's really interesting because, as you can see, relative to the drainage area and where Upper Sioux and then Lower Sioux is just down a little ways too, it's not a very large footprint in terms of their trust lands. And so a lot of the water quality issues they deal with are kind of out of their control. And so, yeah, I've learned a lot about going to the tribal water workshop and really trying to understand a lot of the threats that these tribes are dealing with, and understanding that wetlands and kind of water quality and these things are just one of many different things. And so we're trying to kind of relay that, and then also as we develop our decision support tools, we're looking forward to engaging with folks again to see how we can help them in their management goals.
Thank you. So there is a question for you in the chat, and it says, thanks, Owen. Cool project. How are you guys translating from changes in climate to changes in surface water?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So we have this model here that we've been developing to work on a variety of sized wetland basins. So this is kind of our home base up here where I am near Jamestown, North Dakota, where we've the pothole hydrology link system simulator simulates surface water, as well as a little bit in terms of the salinity aspects of wetlands. And then we've been applying future climate scenarios. So we can run this on a daily time step using temperature and precipitation inputs. And so then we've been able to explore future climate runs and simulating surface water dynamics using this model at that individual basin scale. And then we can also estimate when these wetlands of different sizes are going to spill and how much they're spilling. And so then we're incorporating that into not only the water quantity estimates, but also our water quality model as well. Hope that answers the question.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I think we might have time. Do we have time just for one more question? I don't see any coming in just yet.
I think we should move on. And then again, hopefully we'll have a few extra minutes at the end of the hour here to open it up for more questions. So feel free to keep putting questions in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll keep an eye on them.
All right. Perfect. Well, I'm going to move on to our
I don't know if it's just me or if you cut out, Desi.
I don't hear anything.
Yeah, we lost her.
All right. Well, I'll say, go ahead, Dan. I think you can.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Dan Griffin. I'm an associate professor at the Twin Cities campus, the University of Minnesota, in the Department of Geography, and also affiliate with the St. Anthony Falls Lab. How am I coming through? Just for a sanity check. Jess, can you hear me?
You sound great. You've got your screen up. Looks good.
Okay, super.
Excellent.
Today, I'm going to talk about a Midwest Cask project that I'm just really thrilled and surprised by, and I'm really excited to have the chance to speak with you all. And I'm part of a collaboration working to try to understand the history and future for the floodplain forest growing along the upper Mississippi River between about St. Paul and Dubuque. And so there's a photograph in the lower right of a floodplain forest, pretty typical for this system, and similar to what we saw in the last presentation. It's a fairly small footprint, but it is significant in a bunch of ways. So for background, the resilience of floodplain forests and their ecosystem services is considered to be critical for adaptation to climate change. Along the upper Mississippi River, floodplain forests may continue to face changes in surface hydrology, particularly with an increasingly variable discharge regime. And so through collaboration among resource practitioners and scientists, we were working to co-produce new data sets and modeling to explore forest growth dynamics and ecosystem coupling to variability in hydroclimate. And so a key component of this project is the development of new, well-replicated tree ring data from thousands of trees at 13 sites in floodplain forests along the upper Mississippi River. And so that's kind of how I got involved. For a little bit more context, incidentally, here's a photograph that was published in the Twin Cities Star Tribune last summer that highlights a bit of a paradox that forest managers along the Mississippi River, the upper Mississippi River, are facing. And that's that there are some really broad swaths of forest mortality that are disconcerting. And so forest managers in the system are really trying to management efforts around sustainability, and they're facing a whole myriad of threats, including invasive species and climate change and other unknown things. So the work that I'm involved with now really has its origins from the stakeholder group. And so although he's not formally involved, Andy Meyer is one of our principal partners on the work that CASC has funded. He's a forester in the La Crescent sector for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And Andy and Dr. Molly Van Apeldoorn and Dr. Marcelo Windmuller-Campione have been working hard to collect these tree ring data and try to make some sense of what's going on. I mean, they have fundamental questions about the forest stand history and how these forests are responding to the hydrological conditions, and of course, what might be expected in the future. And so that's where they brought me in as a tree ring scientist, and Matthew Trumper is a staffer in my group, and Lydia Voth-Rurup is working with Marcella's group. So just for a little bit of context, we've got data from 13 sites, 108 plots, 14 species of trees were sampled. And so almost 2,000 tree cores that incidentally were sampled prior to the funding of the CASC work. And so under the auspice of the CASC project in year one, we've been focused on leveraging emerging technologies that I've been incubating in my group to make sense of these data. And so we're combining gigapixel macro photography with online image analysis techniques and meticulous cross-dating and dendrochronology to make some sense of this. And so just to give you a little bit of a flavor for what that looks like, this is a screen capture that we made, a video capture of Dendro Elevator. This is our online open source platform for dendrochronology. And so we're now imaging every stick of wood that comes through my group at better than microscope quality resolution. This is big data. We push it into the cloud. And then through our browser native analysis toolbox, we're able to do very meticulous cellular level histology. So you can probably see the individual cells there. And here we're annotating the markup for the individual rings. And then down below, you can see the data viewer over time. And so this turns out to be really important with silver maple, which has tree ring anatomy that is diffuse porous, it's complicated. It also suffers from a number of anatomical irregularities, and it's really difficult to get the cross dating right. And that turns out to be important for a bunch of reasons that I'll mention in just a moment. Here's a still image from a paper that Matthew Trumper is working on to lead. We plan to submit this later this month. And it illustrates annual growth ring boundaries for silver maple. This is the dominant overstory tree species that exists along the floodplain forest in the upper Mississippi sector. And you can see some interesting annual rings there, like in the top panel, 1963 has kind of a lighter color. We see that a lot. That's a real opportunity for effective cross dating. In the middle panel, you can see what we call a false ring boundary. It looks like it should be a growth ring, but it's actually not. And we know this through meticulous cross comparison within and amongst trees. And then down in the bottom panel, you can see the challenges of cross dating through the very faint sapwood that occurs near the bark. And so I don't want to steal too much of their thunder, but Lydia Voth-Rurup is leading a paper that looks at the stand age history across this ecosystem. This histogram style plot illustrates the estimated inner year of growth at breast height for all of the trees in the system. And so this is fundamental knowledge that our stakeholder forest managers did not have before and are really interested to understand. Another component of this is to try to constrain the relationship between tree size and tree age. So I'd like to take the few minutes that I have left now to explore some of the work that I'm leading in the group. And here we're really trying to understand the relationship between tree growth across the ecosystem and coupled to hydrologic conditions. So this is what we call a spaghetti plot. Each individual red line is the trace of silver maple growth averaged up to the site level. So there are 13 traces there. And one of the things that I see when I look at this is that there seems to be some increasing synchrony over time. And so one of the ways we can look at that is through a pairwise running correlation analysis. And I'll spare you the details, except to say that in the most recent decades, the tree growth has synchronized across all of the sites. And so this seems to be particularly evident for about the last 40 or 50 years. And we have some ideas about what might be going on here, but it does raise some big questions. When we have large scale synchrony in ecosystem productivity, that puts the ecosystem at risk to acute shocks. And of course, this has been described by ecologists around the so-called Moran effect. So we're learning some new things about the dominant overstory trees in the system, and that is that they are synchronizing over time. It turns out they're also synchronizing increasingly with stream flow. So here's a daily stream flow hydrograph on the Mississippi River at Winona. And so this is a key gauge below the confluence of the Chippewa River and the Minnesota and the St. Croix along with the Mississippi. And so we've got the full period of record common with the tree rings, 1929 through 2018. The first half, the daily hydrograph is shown in orange colors. And for the second half, 1974 to 2018, it's shown in blue colors. And you can see there that every single day has a higher median discharge in the more recent decades than it did in the first half of the record. And so we're seeing rising stream flow. And it seems to be particularly evident across the April through July window that we've identified as being relevant for the forest system. And I won't go into the details of that, but I do want to show you these graphs where we correlate. Actually, this is R squared. So we're calculating the shared variance between discharge in the Mississippi, April through July, versus ecosystem-wide tree growth. And for the early period, 1929 through 73, a fairly weak relationship, R squared of 0.19. But for the more recent decades, it's an incredibly strong, shocking to me, really strong relationship. 65% of the variance is shared between stream flow and tree growth. And what this tells me is that discharge is the overwhelming driver of interannual scale productivity in this ecosystem. And when we look at the time series expression of this, now down below with the stream flow in blue and the tree rings in orange and black, we can see that it's really the wet years that seem to be synchronizing tree growth, and it's the wet years that the trees seem to be responding to so very favorably. So that surprised us, and it surprised our stakeholder collaborators who thought that high flows were bad for trees, and maybe they are, and it's a complicated thing. What are we going to do next? Well, the data we're developing is intended to provide information for some forward modeling that will integrate Landis-2 forward models of forest succession, along with spatially explicit surface water floodplain inundation modeling that the USGS is doing. So that's work that we're aspiring to pursue in year 2, which has just begun for us. We're also going to continue to engage with our stakeholder groups. Here's a photo from a site visit where we were able to connect with forest managers from various state, federal, and NGO organizations. And so with that, I'll leave my key points on the screen. I'll be happy to take any questions that you might have. Thanks for the time, and thanks for this funding too. It's been a really, really eye-opening project.
Great. Thank you so much, Daniel. My apologies. My internet cut off briefly there for a moment, but I was able to catch most of your great presentation. So thank you. We do have one question queued up from the chat and from Leland, and his question is, would it be useful to compare with Acer saccharinum in upland settings such as urban landscaping?
Thanks for that question. It would absolutely be useful to compare these floodplain forest responses with those from other settings. And I never thought I'd care at all about silver maple, but now I catch myself looking everywhere I go. I mean, it's kind of a trashy tree. It grows fast, it drops sap and branches. And And so we have a lot of questions. We're curious if how localized is this to the highly integrative nature of this particular geography? What would we see if we looked off tributaries? What about urban? Okay, here's another question. Thank you, Dr. Ladie. Might the longevity of inundation be responsible for reducing those gains in productivity? That's a good question. Do you mean seasonally? Could I ask for clarification there? Do you mean that inundation is lasting longer into the season due to the changes in hydrology and maybe some management too? Is that kind of the question?
Yeah, just that you have longer periods of standing water that might be causing mortality, right? But even though you have these sort of shorter term gains in productivity.
That's a really
You're doing
good
that next,
point.
right? Or
Yes,
Dan?
that's absolutely correct. Spatially explicit modeling, I think at 4-meter resolution. And we've got, we're really excited to explore topoclimate connections, fine scale topoclimate connections to tree growth. And it wasn't really included in the original proposal, but I'm really curious about the geographies of this mortality. And I wonder too about other disturbance factors like beavers, for example. I've seen near the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi River after 2019, I saw some expanded beaver lodge activities and some mortality there too. So that's a great question. Thanks so much. Professor Arnold, how much among tree variation is there in tree age within a particular stand? Is there any evidence that major flood events kill everything and lead to greater within stand synchrony than occurred historically? Ooh, that's a big question. I hope we might be able to take a nibble at that. It's a little tricky. These are mostly second growth forests that have their origins in the early 20th century, 1920s and 30s, which is of course about the time that these check dams were built in the system. And so I think the lack of synchrony early on may have to do with primary succession and these trees investing in vertical growth and trying to establish, and synchrony may be related to kind of a later stage situation. The flooding thing, gosh, I hope we can get at that. Thanks so much for that question, Professor Arnold.
Okay, well, I think that's all I'm seeing in the chat. So at this point, we've got about 10 minutes left. And I think if we could take a few minutes here and bring everyone back on. And if you could mind turning your videos on. Yep, there we go, everyone. And just we'll take this opportunity. There was one more question that had come in, I think while I was gone, for Dan Isermann. But if you have any other questions for either Dan Isermann, Daniel Griffin, or Owen McKenna, please go ahead and add it to the chat here. And if you're more comfortable, if you want to just raise your hand and address our panel, you can do that as well. And while giving you guys a little bit of time there to put those in, I wanted to go ahead and just pose one question to everyone, each of our speakers. And I like to ask this of all researchers because I think sometimes the answers are a little bit surprising and it's always interesting. But were there, what was the most interesting thing you learned, or did you encounter any surprises in your research that you'd like to share? And I'll start with you, Daniel, since you're right here.
I think you mean me. I was surprised to see the very strong positive relationship between tree growth and high flow. That goes against what our stakeholders and forest managers more familiar with the system than me had expected. It also goes against first order expectation from my corner of science and dendroclimatology, where we would not expect to find a tight coupling between tree growth and climate in a floodplain system. And so a little bit, shame on me because I wasn't appreciative for how variable water level can be during the midsummer, which I think matters a lot for these trees, especially in June. And so that was really surprising. And we have a bunch of questions that have stemmed from that.
Thank you. Owen, you want to tackle that?
Sure. Yeah. So I think one thing that I'm learning navigating kind of wetland management from different agencies and different groups, especially in the Minnesota River Basin, is how much wetland restoration and management happens for different reasons. And so I think we tried to focus some of our analysis on that to highlight these different ecosystem services, because maybe EPA might be funding things for Clean Water Act reasons, and NRCS might be funding things from the Farm Bill's perspective, and Fish and Wildlife Service might be funding things from NACA's perspective. But yeah, getting folks to kind of see these things, different large kind of especially federal programs for wetland restoration and management, but having kind of different reasons why folks are doing it has been interesting for me to have these conversations to show folks the bigger landscape.
Great, thank you. Dan Isermann.
Yeah, I would say the biggest surprise really was sort of the lack of information that was available for many of the species of fish that probably would have been interesting in our modeling approach. And some of that's just related to agency resources and how much sampling can be done. But largemouth bass are really important in our models, and there's a surprising number of places where we just don't routinely collect information on them because we're actually so hyper focused on things like walleye and muskies, and arguably bass are a fish of our future in the northern tier of the region. So that might be something that will have to change over time.
Thank you. And Dan, I'm going to keep you on here because a question came in for you. I believe it, yeah, for Dan. What time scale is generally considered short-term versus long-term in fish management strategies? Are we talking a few years here, decades, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the context of when a state might like draft up a management plan for a species like walleye, those are often in place for decades. But sometimes things are far more immediate. It's really hard to make decisions on stocking where you might have a couple of years where things don't look very good, and then do you make your decision to stop stocking fish at that point, or do you want to stretch that out over a longer window of time? And I think in some cases we might be forced to make decisions at a shorter time scale than we'd like, just because if the resource is limited or finite in some cases, you're going to have to start doing that as you lose natural reproduction. And a lot of those lakes are actually going to be the lakes where stocking is more likely to be successful because they once supported actual natural reproduction. You might have to make decisions on a shorter time scale than what we might like to do.
Thank you. And for the other Dan, who I've been calling Daniel, I hope that's correct, Daniel. Are you examining mortality? Tree mortality can also be an important response to climate and other environmental factors.
Thanks so much, Richard, for that question. Not yet, at least not in my group. And I see my USGS PI collaborator, Dr. Molly Van Appledorn, is in the room. I don't mean to put you on the spot, Molly. I know you guys have some data that are well situated to look at this. In other projects that I'm doing in a kind of global change biology framework out west in particular, we are looking at acute climate shocks as drivers of mortality. And so I think there's good capacity to do that. Unfortunately, a lot of the mortality that's happened was after the data that we're working with was collected. So it might need to happen in some sort of future funding mechanism or project.
Thank you. Well, looks like we have one final question I think we have time for Owen. And this is how well do you think the hydrology models handle atypical rainfall events that might be outside the limits of historical ranges?
Yeah, great question. I think that's been the focus of using more process-based simulation models rather than using statistical models so that we could basically have the physics embedded in there for the size and shape of your wetland basins. And hopefully we're representing that in that physically based way that can handle wetter, drier situations. And we've been learning as we go along too, and as our records of monitoring data kind of captures more extreme events as well.
Great. Well, I want to thank all of our speakers for joining us today. Some really great talks, great questions, great discussion. This has really been wonderful. So thank you all. And I'm going to pass it over to Jess now, who's going to close it out for us.
Yeah, again, thanks so much to all of our speakers. Thank you all for joining us and asking great questions. I know there's a couple we didn't get to in the chat that came in at the end, but I'm sure you could reach out to any of our panelists and they'd be happy to connect with you directly. I'm going to launch a quick poll for you to tell us how we did. And I also dropped a link to register for our whole spring series of seminars. We've just announced our topics. We will have speaker and other details out soon. But if you want to get those on your calendar now, you can register for 1, 2, or all 3 of them. And we look forward to seeing you there. Thanks, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your Mondays. Bye.